David and Saul appear to have come to an agreement for now. Saul will stop trying to kill David, and he realizes David will be king one day. But David won't go back to the palace to resume his service, and that doesn't leave him too happy. Let's pick up the story from there. I'm Ken Godevanis, and this is Digging for Scriptural Gems. Today we study 1 Samuel chapter 27, verses 1 to 7. This is no doubt a weak moment in David's life. He still fears that he will die one day at the hands of Saul, so his best bet in his mind is to escape to the land of the Philistines. That's what his heart tells him to do. You heard correctly. Saul will get tired of searching for him in Israel, he thinks, and thus he'll escape Saul's murderous hand by hiding out in the land of the Philistines. We may well ask, where was David's faith at that moment? So David and 600 of his men crossed over to be with Akish, the son of Maok, king of Gath. He, with his 2 wives, that's David and his 2 wives, and each of his men set up a household there. Gath was one of those 5 Philistine cities we had studied earlier in this book. The ruins are still there today. And when Saul heard about this, guess what? He stopped searching for David. Now one may ask, why did Akish accept David at this time? Well, for starters, they both had the same enemy now, Saul. Second, David's 600 men would come in handy for Akish to use as mercenaries. As time passed, David asked Akish if he would give him a place in one of the cities in the countryside so he wouldn't be in the way intruding on the royal city where Akish lived. Perhaps David did not want to be a threat to Akish as he had been to Saul. A wise move on his part. Also, given what he wanted to do, as we will see next time, best to be a little out of the way. And Akish gave him Ziglag. And the text says that going forward, Ziglag belonged to the kings of Judah, at least to the days of writing 1 Samuel. Though originally it was assigned to Judah, Joshua chapter 15, verse 31, subsequently it was assigned to Simeon when they did some redistribution of land, Joshua 19:5. However, this town had never been possessed by the Israelites. It belonged to the Philistines, who now give it to David as per our passage here. Matthew Henry says, quote, "But either Ziglag was never subdued, or the Philistines had, in some struggle with Israel, made themselves masters of it. Perhaps they had got it unjustly, and Akish, being a man of sense and honor, took this occasion to restore it. The righteous God judgeth righteously." End of quote. Yes, he does indeed, even in our disobedience. The last verse in our package tells us that David lived there for a year and 4 months. Some may call this political asylum. We'll stop there and go digging for scriptural gems. David was being negative and thinking negatively. As humans, we will do that from time to time. But that does not mean that those negative things will indeed happen. We cannot live our lives like that. God is in control, and we either believe that or we don't. That does not mean we should not be aware of how difficult things may get, especially these days for the Christian. We need to be aware of those possibilities and take the recommended actions for our safety. God expects us to use our brains. He gave them to us. But our faith must be in God to protect us or to see us through it all. We will see that the rest of this chapter tells a rather sad and grim story. David Guzik points out that it all started out with what David told himself, or as the Hebrew text implies, what David was told in his heart. Bad things begin in our hearts. All sins begin in our heart. They don't have to be verbalized. What we say in our heart has a tremendous power to shape our thinking, our actions, and ultimately our destiny. Our heads must be used to guard our hearts. David's fear and awful prediction was set in his heart because he had become tired of trusting God for his deliverance. Do you ever feel that way? When we do so because we seem to forget how God has delivered us in the past. That's one way our heads, our memories, can be used to fight the negative feelings of our hearts. We need to remember God's faithfulness to us. It's one thing for David to leave Israel, but it's another for him to go and dwell among idol worshipers. He knew how much God hated the worship of idols and idolatry. And that's the danger of listening to our hearts when it's talking rubbish to us. We listen, we believe, and take action that leads to us living among idol worshipers, be it for money, for sex, violence, whatever. It happens that easily, as we'll see with David. It needs to be nipped in the bud. David Gusick has a most interesting perspective on this. He writes, quote, Saul could never drive David to the Philistines. If Saul told David, David, you must leave the people of God and go live among the Philistines, David would never bow to it. But discouragement and despair are more powerful enemies than Saul. Discouragement and despair will drive David to do something that Saul could never make him do. End of quote. And so it is with us. We would never let someone else tell us to feel or to act in a way that we instinctively know is wrong for us. But we would listen to our own discouraged and despaired hearts. We would listen to ourselves when we're discouraged and despaired. A good example may be someone having a hard time in school or in their job and thinking they can't do this any longer. When we feel like that, we need to think about how we got to that point and why. And if necessary, we need to check our feelings out with others, and most importantly, with God and His Word. If you flip back to 1 Samuel chapter 21, verses 10 to 15, you will be reminded of the fact that David had already gone to Gath before, and that didn't turn out very well. In fact, it turned out really badly. To save his life, he had to pretend that he was a madman. God had allowed that to happen to teach him something. But the feeling of despair is so strong that David went down that same path again. And the sad thing about this is that when we believe our discouraging and despairing heart, we're not the only ones that suffer. David took 600 men and their families to live with him in the land of idol worshippers. I can only feel for the damage that a discouraged parent who listens to his discouraging heart causes for their spouse, their children, and others. Let us be aware of the damage that listening to our despair could cause. Let us do all we can to fight it off with God's help and by His grace. Gusick tells us that David accomplished his immediate goal because Saul stopped pursuing him. But now, David is in a place of compromise that will leave him worse off than before. He's actually submitting to a Philistine master. We need to be aware of being fooled by temporary relief when following our heart into evil. Unless we do a sincere U-turn, the end will be disaster for us and for others. Being a political refugee is no fun. Can you imagine? I mean, we're talking about David here. Can you imagine him referring to himself as your servant in speaking to a Philistine king? Can you imagine him seeking the favor of the eyes of Akish? And there's also no record of David writing any psalms during this time in Gath. Follow our despairing hearts, and life can easily become gloomy and sad and take some very bad turns. I thank God that He allowed this part of David's life to be shared and preserved for us in Scripture so that we may learn from it and save ourselves the misery that David had to endure. Don't miss that lesson. Let's learn it together. Next time, we'll learn about David's, remember, he's been anointed by God, we'll learn about David's new occupation, which one commentator calls that of a roving bandit. Join us for that.